On the Common Link Theory, Chapter 1, The Formation and Development of the Common Link Theory, hereinafter referred to as the CLT. The CLT has provoked a wide array of reactions, ranging from utter rejection to total acceptance as the ideal approach to understanding the formation of the prophetic narrative. This chapter investigates the development of the theory by tracing its origins and subsequent development. It is equally important to elaborate upon the significance of the CLT by comparing it with other theories related to the formation of prophetic tradition. In order to clarify Schacht's position on prophetic tradition, I will first delineate his perspective on the CLT and delve into the differences in understanding this theory with separate Schachtians from other contemporary scholars. Despite initial contributions by A. Sprenger, C. S. Haronji, Ignaz Goldziher, D. S. Margolioth, H. Leymans, G. Bergstrasser, H. A. R. Gibb, it can be shown that Schacht was responsible for developing a fuller and a more scientific approach of the problem of Hadith transmission. However, it remains true that the influence of preceding scholarship, Goldziher's particularly, is unmistakable in Schacht's writing. In his first challenge to the historical authenticity of Islamic traditions, Schacht developed Goldziher's view that these traditions are not a mass of contradictory views formulated at an unknown time by unknown people. According to Schacht, one of these foundations I may take for granted is Goldziher's discovery that the traditions from the Prophet and from his companions do not contain more or less authentic information on the earliest period of Islam, to which they claim to belong, but reflect opinions held during the first 2.5 centuries after the Hijrah. Goldziher had expressed the matter thus: judged by scientific criterion, only a very small part, if any, of the contents of these canonical compilations can be confidently referred to the early period to which they profess to date. The earliest announcement by Schacht of his intention to examine the prophetic tradition according to Goldziher's criteria may be found in his article A Re-Evaluation of Islamic Tradition, wherein he states, I propose to show a workable, and I think, a successful alternative to the counsel of despair which, finding no guiding thread through the mass of traditions, tries by arbitrary guesswork to build a seemingly historical picture of certain aspects of early Islam. I elaborated the method while studying the origins of Mohammedan jurisprudence. Schacht aimed to provide a more accurate and methodical approach to the study of Islamic law in order to prove the claims of Orientalist discourse correct, particularly Goldziher's assumptions. The cornerstone of Schacht's method is his CLT, as articulated in the Origins, and upon which his entire enterprise is contingent. Therefore, what will now follow will be an analysis and an evaluation of his theory, which is crucial for a serious assessment of Schacht and his followers. Schacht's CLT developed over time. In Schacht's own writings we can clearly see changes in his opinion towards the prophetic tradition, changes to which he himself draws our attention. A survey of Schacht's articles and books reveals that, in his earliest writings, he is silent on the theory, even when matters directly pertaining to Islamic law. For example, he refers to the existence of Hadith transmission from an early time, stating, the role of the Sunnah is best illustrated by the fact that in Islam, Sunnite is synonymous with orthodox. Muhammad's religious authority, even beyond the statements of the Quran, could not be questioned, and soon after his death people began to cite him as a model. However, when explaining the development of Hadith, Schacht suggests that several factors resulted in a mass of fabricated traditions. The most influential of these factors are the historical ones, foreign elements that precipitated the transmission of those fabricated hadiths, which will later have an influence on his CLT. He says, in the meanwhile, religious institutions and doctrines continued to develop under Jewish, Christian and Persian influences. If Islam was to maintain its position as an independent religion, it had no choice but to pretend that these elements were traditions emanating from the Prophet himself. Finally, there was no better way of establishing disputed points of view than to ascribe them to the words of Muhammad. Thus, everything absorbed by Islam during the course of its first few centuries had to be stamped by a gigantic fiction as the Sunnah of the Prophet and put into the form of Hadith, as a result of which the true kernel of tradition was almost entirely concealed. In the 9th century, canonical collections were made from the huge mass of orally transmitted traditions. In the same article, Schacht persists in using a similar approach to historical causality, contending that the relationship between the Islamic legislation and the customary law remained the same as before, even after the latter had been increasingly exposed to the foreign influence as a result of vast conquests. Schacht presumed that his historical influence on Hadith might be taken for granted in Western academia, as shown by his remark, despite the fact that the influence of customary law and a foreign legal practice, although not a foreign legal theory, was very important and was taken for granted in the early period of Islamic law, their further infiltration grew extremely difficult after the acceptance of the concept of usul in its final form. In addition to the historical factors, Schacht considered the political context to have played a role in giving rise to his theory related to Hadith in general, especially through the move of the capital of the Islamic Empire from Medina to Damascus, where foreign elements, especially that of Judaic law, were introduced into Islamic law through the prophetic traditions. He writes, with the rise of the Umayyad dynasty and the transfer of the capital to Damascus, the pious circle of the former capital Medina lost their influence upon the government and began to construct with actual circumstances trying to systemize the existing legal material and to infuse with it Islamic religious principles. It was this group which laid the foundations of Islamic jurisprudence, fiqh, to emphasize the authority of Medina. They gave particular weight to the sayings and actions of their predecessors, Muhammad's associates, especially to majority decisions. This deference to majority, ijma', favoured the development of common doctrine and the elimination of isolated viewpoints. The results of this speculation were largely formulated in traditions and attributed to the Prophet himself. In this process, many new elements, especially those of Jewish origin, were again introduced. Confirming the ambiguous meaning of the term sunnah, Schacht credits its ultimate definition to Shafi'i, stating he finally fixed the concept of sunnah as meaning the Prophet's own practices. At this stage, Schacht rejects what we call the gratuitous assumptions that an authentic core of information going back to the time of the Prophet originally existed. To this view, Islamic tradition must be considered objectively within a framework that corresponds to the development of its historical problems. This will uncover a number of criteria for establishing the relative and even absolute chronology of a great many traditions. These criteria can be found in the traditions, both in the texts and the isnads, supporting Schacht's interpretation of the transmissions of Hadith based upon his own understanding.